Thank you very much, David, for that wonderful introduction. David has been a true resource and friend for many years, and one of the things that he didn't mention is I first knew him when I was going to school here in Michigan at Godwin High School. We had a planetarium there. In fact, we were talking about that over dinner with Jack Gillespie, the current director of the Chaffee Planetarium here. How I got interested in space was through the planetarium. And we had a planetarium at that time, plus we would go to meetings for the Chaffee Planetarium downtown. And that's when I first kind of met David, because I had published a little newsletter at that time called Probe, which was printed on a ditto machine. And some folks might know what that is, but it's that purple stuff that you could, if your substitute teacher wanted an easy way to get through the class while he or she was filling in for your regular teacher, they'd run off some dittos and you'd get high on the fumes as they were being printed, and you'd get through the hour. But I ran that on a regular basis and had a lot of fun with it. And I remember to this day that David picked up a copy of that at one of our meetings. And I was, I think, 14 or 15 at the time, and I was very impressed with that because he had looked at it and recognized it. So I've been a writer for quite some time and interested in space history for probably as long as I can remember. But what I wanted to do this evening was share with you some thoughts regarding some of the history that has been occurring, especially this past month in July, with these private space efforts of Virgin Galactic as well as Blue Origin. All of you probably in attendance have seen these flights either as they happen through the internet or on television or watched them on YouTube. But I thought I'd show my intro slide here with Wally Funk. That expression on her face is just amazing. She's 82 years old and has now been certified as the oldest person to have flown into space after she returned from her historic flight on July 20th, which coincidentally was the anniversary date of when the Apollo astronauts landed first on the surface of the moon. So here we have a woman who has quite an amazing background and career, finally flying to space. She actually trained in a study that NASA did not fund, but was privately held to see about the feasibility of having women go into space back at the time when that was pretty much a male-dominated field early on with Project Mercury. And she, as well as others, formed what we kind of refer to now as the Mercury 13, a group of women that trained privately at the Lovelace Clinic to see how well they could basically perform in space like their male counterparts. And the study, again, was privately funded, but it did show a lot of really good information. One of the things is that they could actually perform far better, both physiologically as well as mentally, like their counterparts. But unfortunately, during that period of time in the 1960s and when space flight was extremely new, we did not want to see, we being the public in general and the people in charge with NASA, didn't really want to have a woman be killed or injured during these very early pioneering days of space flight. And so, unfortunately, she, as well as her 12 others, did not see that time. But it's just so wonderful that she's been able to do it now with this historic flight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these flights in general, and I promise you I will finish up no later than 9 o'clock, and that includes Q&A, so that we can all leave at a decent time for this wonderful evening that we've had tonight so far. But I want to talk to you about some of the early precursors before some of these commercial flights, when people launched away from this planet into space. That occurred still gives us pause and remains newsworthy, because astronaut means star voyager. Even after 60 years of doing it, it remains a pretty exclusive club, as fewer than 600 people have been into space. Yuri Gagarin, who is shown here, was the first to leave what some would have called humanity's cradle on April 12, 1961. A cosmonaut, Gagarin flew into orbit and into the history books and helped ignite space that culminated in 2 men walking on the surface of the moon. The same politics that helped get us to boldly land on the moon before the end of the decade also hindered us from getting any further. With humanity stuck in low Earth orbit, reality began to set in about the high cost of routine access to space, even though we proved that we could boldly go where no one had gone before. Space remained out of reach for all but the privileged few. The space shuttle began in the 1980s, and it was sold to the American public as a cheaper means of getting things and people from here to Earth. Indeed, the term shuttle implies a routine or commonplace transportation. Politicians were sold on its promise of reducing the cost of getting both payload and people off the Earth. Unfortunately, the technology needed to achieve cheaper access to space proved to be very expensive and never really kept the promise of low-cost access into orbit. Tragically, 2 accidents during the 30-year life of the shuttle program proved to everyone how challenging it was to hurl something into orbit and bring it all safely back. The space shuttle program was remarkable both for what it was and what it wasn't, a program that tried to appease many sectors of the aerospace community while at the same time providing justification for a continued human presence in space during a time period here in the United States when maintaining that presence was in real jeopardy. Most folks forget that the post-Apollo world of the mid-1970s after we landed on the moon included a, quote, been there, done that attitude both from Congress and the White House, who began to question the very existence of NASA. The space shuttle gave us continued human access to space during a time when nothing else would, and the promise of reusability helped sell the idea. During the shuttle's ascent, parts of the massive rocket that were used to send the winged orbiter into space fell back into the ocean, where they were recovered, dried out and cleaned, and then reloaded and fueled to be flown again. Likewise, the massive winged orbiter would fly back to where it took off and was refurbished and flown again and again. On the surface, it looked like this was all very routine, reusable, and relatively cheap. But in reality, it was none of these things. What the space shuttle wasn't was what it had promised, a reusable and inexpensive means for payloads and people to shuttle back and forth from space. The program was exceptionally complex as it stretched the limits of what technology would allow us to do at the time. Even though the shuttle first flew in 1981, it was built using technology from decades prior. That said, the space shuttle gave us the Hubble Space Telescope, the International Space Station, and a wealth of knowledge. For a while, we boldly went, not to the planets or stars, but into low Earth orbit, where we continued to try and figure out how we could do it cheaper. We learned that flying winged spaceships from Earth into orbit may look cool, but may not actually be the best approach. Carrying something massively large and heavy that would be used only during the last minutes of the space mission may not be the best use of technology or the precious fuel that you needed in order to get there and back. What we did learn was that the traditional rockets, the kind without wings, were the way to go if you could reuse most of the pieces involved to get you safely to space and back. When the space shuttle proved to be so massively complex and expensive to operate, NASA and the aerospace sector focused on looking at other options. The elusive goal of bolting Goli into space hinged on decreasing costs. Once that goal was achieved, it was reasoned that greater access would follow. So what they started doing during this period of time, mainly in the mid-1990s, was exploring other options. And one of the options that they looked at was something called the DCX, which was short for Delta Clipper Experimental. This was an innovative program that McDonnell Douglas started, and it basically was a demonstrator to show that we could take off vertically from the ground and land vertically. So it was a spacecraft that was really never designed initially to go into space, but a demonstrator to kind of prove the technology of a spacecraft that could launch on legs and land on legs. So you see this kind of composite here of the sequence of one of the early test flights of this vehicle showing kind of an all too familiar, formation that we kind of take for granted now with the SpaceX. Because SpaceX, of course, takes off vertically, and the first stages land also vertically, not only on the ground, but on the ocean, on the little platform that's off the coast of where it landed. So this was a demonstrator that was done in the 1990s. A lot of people kind of forget this, but this was, I remember watching this at the time during these tests, just being how awed I was at seeing this, because this really looked like a spaceship from the 1950s. Especially when it was landing on legs, rather than splashing down as a capsule, or even landing with wings like the space shuttle. So this was one of the programs that NASA was exploring along with some of the other contractors. Another one was called the Rotary Rocket Rotund spacecraft. This was another spacecraft that also was kind of pushing the limits for vertical takeoff and landing. And basically, the initial design was that this thing would take off like a helicopter from the ground, and then once it reached an altitude where the atmosphere was too thin for the aerodynamic effects of the helicopter to produce any more lift, it would basically launch the rest of the way. Well, the thing didn't really quite work in that initial formation, so they went back and revised it and redesigned it so that the helicopter idea would still work, but it would be used to help recover the vehicle. So the rocket would take off vertically, like a traditional rocket, go into space, and then when it came back, it would re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Once it got back into the atmosphere, the helicopter would kick in and basically ease its ascent or descent to the rest of the way until it lands. So this was another concept that they were looking at that time. Now, since that, NASA was continuing to look at other options, but one of the themes of these vehicles was this idea of a single stage to orbit. They were looking as a follow-on to the space shuttle of basically having a vehicle that could essentially launch into space, taking all its fuel with it, and coming back in its entirety. So, single stage to orbit launch vehicle. The problem was it really pushed the technology even more so than the shuttle. I remember going to a conference one time, and they were looking at one of the studies, which was a follow-on to the DCX called the X-33 Venture Star, where it was again a single stage to orbit vehicle. And essentially what they could prove is that, yeah, we could launch the vehicle, but we couldn't carry anything with it. Essentially, we could take all our fuel and everything and get into space, but we couldn't take crew, we couldn't take payload. So that particular form of access to space really just was not working out very well. But they were studying it at the time. So next, I want to talk a little bit about where we're bringing it up today with the internet. When the history of the late 20th and early 21st centuries is written, the development of the internet will loom large because of its transformative effects on our culture. Two names have emerged as being most associated with not just the rise of the internet, but how it was used. Jeff Bezos staked his success on using the internet to help sell books. What started out as an online bookstore evolved into Amazon, the Walmart of the internet. Around that same time, Elon Musk used his computer and business skills to found PayPal. Last but not least, we should throw into this exclusive club Paul Allen, who along with Bill Gates co-founded Microsoft. And if you don't know who these folks are, which one is which here, I'm sure all of you know who Elon Musk is, holding a Starship model. This, of course, is Jeff Bezos, of Blue Origin fame. Elon Musk, of course, is SpaceX. This is Paul Allen, co-founder along with Bill Gates of Microsoft Corporation. He unfortunately passed away in 2018, but his legacy lives on through this vehicle up here, which is held by Sir Richard Branson of Virgin Galactic, who bought the technology and of Spaceship One from Paul Allen and Scaled Composites and commercialized it into Spaceship Two eventually, which is what flew last month on July 8th, 10th? 11th. July 11th, to beat Jeff Bezos on his flight into space with Spaceship Two. So all these folks, other than perhaps Richard Branson, really had their claim to fame, made their millions, or billions I should say, with the internet. And what's interesting is that these folks devoted a lot of their money, their fortune, vast amount they had, into flying into space. Wanting to go where basically no one has gone before. And of course, we all saw the results of two of these individuals, Bezos, and of course, Paul Allen and Sir Richard Branson, with the launches of the Virgin Galactic's flight and Blue Origin's flight. But one of the things I should point out is on those two flights, there was only one actually fully commercial paid for customer. And that was a fellow by the name of Oliver Damon, who flew aboard Blue Origin. He was the only one that actually paid for his flight. So he was really kind of the first commercial paid tourist of most recent time. But one of the things I should point out is that he was not the very first. There was one prior to him by the name of Dennis Tito that bought a flight aboard a Soyuz back in the early 2000s and flew to the International Space Station into orbit and stayed aboard there for about 3 days before coming back. So Damon was really the first commercially paid for suborbital flight, whereas Tito was the first one to go into space and of course be into orbit. So looking at all these flights, one of the things, there's Dennis Tito. I know I had a slide of him. That's him right there on the far left over here. And then a couple of the Soviet compatriots that he flew with aboard the Soyuz to launch into space. I was at NASA at the time when his flight occurred in 2001. And of course it was quite controversial at that time. Then NASA Administrator Dan Golden did not approve of his efforts, thought it was kind of a diversion for more important things, and the general party line with NASA at that time was not really support it. But he flew, nevertheless, of course, aboard Soyuz flight rather than an American shuttle flight. But since that time, others had followed on board the ISS and have paid for positions as well to go up there. So with all these commercial flights that are going on and promise of more of them coming, there's a few questions that I started to raise while watching a lot of the activity that was going on over the past month. As more folks pay money for flights into space, the customer is going to begin to ask some questions to make sure that they are getting the most value for their dollar. In turn, the company providing the service will learn to handle these questions in a marketable way that not only assures quality and value, but at the same time help distinguish its product from that of the competition. One of the questions that kind of surfaced, some of the media covered it, as well as others, was a result of this little teaser kind of promotional ad that Jeff Bezos put up at Blue Origin for his New Shepard flight. It points out kind of a comparison between the two flights, Blue Origin's and Galactic, listing some, in blue what Blue Origin's accomplishments or what they were versus Galactic. And you can see a little kind of rivalry going on here on some of the terminology and nitty-pitty nitpick type things that he was pointing out. One of them, of course, is first and foremost that he put up there is flies above the Kármán line, which is the international boundary of recognized of where space begins. And that's really interesting because one of the questions is where exactly does space begin? Where does air end and where does space begin? And that's not a real easy question to answer because the atmosphere that's above us, and there are a lot of layers of atmosphere above us, is a dynamic system. And complicating the things, it's not perfectly spherical because the Earth isn't spherical. It's dependent upon temperatures, climate, time of year, and everything else. But traditionally, what NASA has recognized is kind of the limit of where space begins is a 50-mile limit. If you get to be basically going up there 50 miles or higher, you're into space, and that constitutes an astronaut. But since that time, there have been others that have kind of chimed in on that claim. And this von Karman limit is one of them that's received some notice. It's named after Theodore von Karman, physicist and engineer who proposed that the limit be 62 miles into space, roughly about 100 kilometers. And so it's a little bit higher than 50 miles, 12 miles or so higher. And the reasoning being is that this 62-mile limit is essentially the perigee, where if an object was hurled into space and to go into orbit, it's the lowest point in that orbit where an object can basically go for at least one or more orbits. Essentially, as opposed to a suborbital flight where you're essentially flying this huge arc, like on a roller coaster, going up and then coming back down. In orbital flight, you're doing the same thing, but you're being hurled at a much greater velocity so that the Earth is falling away from you at the same rate that your arc is going around it. So you never really fall back to the Earth because the Earth keeps curving away from you as you continue to go around it. So if you have enough energy, you can sustain that for quite a while. And so von Karman proposed that the 62-mile limit is that lowest point in the Earth's atmosphere where an object can be sustained for a few revolutions, basically the true point of where space begins and the air ends. So a lot of this is, kind of promotional stuff. Of course, when you go into space, you want to make sure that you're recognized as truly being in there. But it can be challenging for those racing to promote commercial flights, basically if there's no agreement exactly on where the finish line is. So this is one of those things that might be discussed even more as time goes on and we launch more people into space that are paying customers. The other thing that it can be considered is what constitutes an astronaut exactly. The 1967 UN Outer Space Treaty defines astronaut as, quote, envoys of mankind into outer space. However, the 1968 UN Rescue Agreement refers to personnel of a spacecraft, which may imply not everyone on board is considered a fully fledged astronaut. Traditionally within NASA, there's been a long unspoken pecking order among the agency's astronauts. At the very top, there are basically the mission commanders, with pilots a close second. Then there are the mission specialists, with payload specialists at the very bottom, since they did not go through the same extensive training as those above them. As a result, some astronauts may look down on those folks with some indignation, seeing them as having merely bought their rise into space. However, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, started awarding commercial astronaut wings in 2004 when Spaceship One, that's the Paul Allen vehicle from Scale Composites, launched Melville and Brian Binney into space, and they received these wings as part of their achievement of being the first ones to a private company to go suborbital into space. They fit the FAA's original criteria for those wings, which included being part of the crew of a vehicle that went into an altitude of at least 50 miles or 80 kilometers. Then, interestingly enough, on July 20th, when Blue Origin flew its first human flight, the FAA issued an update in which they added a third requirement. And that requirement is a demonstrated activities during the flight that were essential to public safety or contributed to human spaceflight safety. So when the program was first created by the FAA in 2004, its focus was to recognize flight crew members who furthered the FAA's mission to promote the safety of vehicles designed to carry humans. The FAA has now changed that focus to recognize flight crews who demonstrate activities during flight that were essential to public safety or contributed to human spaceflight safety, among other criteria. So this new definition has the appearance of de-astronauting some of those who have just flown into space. For example, did Sir Richard Branson, who just flew on Spaceship Two to evaluate the, quote, experience of the flight, perform any work related to public safety or human spaceflight safety? And what about those on New Shepard? First of all, it's not clear anyone who flew on New Shepard would qualify as crew under the FAA regulations, because none of them were actually flying the vehicle, which was controlled entirely from the ground. It's an autonomous vehicle. There's really nothing for a crew member to do but to hang on and enjoy the view. Second, the FAA order doesn't define the term astronaut at all, which makes it even more confusing, and instead lays out the conditions for which it awards astronaut wings. and the term astronaut is not defined in the law. So some members of NASA's astronaut corps, for example, don't have NASA astronaut wings since they have not yet flown into space, but few would not consider them astronauts. Most importantly, though, the revised rule make it more likely people like Bezos and Branson get astronaut wings. The revised rules give the FAA the ability to award honorary commercial astronaut wings to individuals who demonstrate extraordinary contributions or service to the commercial human spaceflight industry. So, there's some confusion here, and a lot of this will hopefully kind of be more clarified as time goes on, and we see more people basically flying in a commercial way into space. So these other wings that I put up here, of course, you have the FAA astronaut wings, which look typically government issued, kind of boring. And then off to the left is basically the Virgin Galactic's wings, which are really cool. I think they're the most interesting because they're patterned after the little helicopter seeds from maple trees. So you can see kind of the seed formation there, which echoes what the Unity spacecraft does once it reaches its apogee, its highest point in its parabolic flight. These wings deploy like the seeds, and it kind of helps stabilize the vehicle as it goes through very, very thin atmosphere until it finally gets into a thick enough atmosphere that the wings move again to a more traditional aircraft setting so that this thing can glide safely back to Earth. And then off to the right, of course, is Blue Origin's wings. So one of the other issues is what about health into space? Basically this idea of stay up in space until you throw up. The zero-G environment of outer space is indeed alien to humans. As one notes, quote, "We grew up in 1G, and when we put ourselves into the environment, we break." Though not so much an issue for the short-term exposure of suborbital flights, prolonged stays in the microgravity environment can cause some health issues. Two astronauts, Scott and Mark Kelly, identical twins, were extensively studied as part of NASA's effort to explore the long-term effects of weightlessness on the human body. Scott Kelly stayed in space aboard the ISS for 340 days, and upon his return to Earth, his medical results were compared to those of his twin brother Mark, who stayed here on the ground. Among the study's findings by NASA was confirmation that reduction in muscle mass and bone deterioration occurred within the body when it stays for long periods of time in space. In addition, long-term vision effects were found to happen along with alterations in DNA and cognition. In addition, without the natural protection offered by the Earth's atmosphere and magnetosphere, those in space risk exposure from long-term radiation effects. The most common problem experienced by humans, both in suborbital and orbital flights, is something called SAS. Now, NASA always has acronyms. They're very popular. NASA is an acronym, but SAS stands for Space Adaptation Syndrome, basically space sickness. And it's related to motion sickness and arises when the vestibular system adapts to weightlessness. No one really knows for sure if they are susceptible to SAS until they actually get up there. Many of the astronauts that I've talked with when I worked at NASA and since, basically there's no real metric or proof or litmus test to show whether you are going to be susceptible or highly susceptible to SAS until you actually get up there. There are preventative things that they can do to kind of help you when you're up there to reduce the effects, but it's just as a surprise to anyone of the severity of the effects once they're up there. So this graphic kind of shows some of those different things that our body undergoes while it's going into space. It's kind of a creepy looking graphic, but it does show some of the different biological changes that occur due to weightlessness. So what if something goes wrong when we're in space? Of course, all of us are present here tonight are aware of the Apollo 1 tragedy that proved that there's much risk involved in the ground as there is up in space. As the space shuttle also proved when it had two accidents, of course Challenger in 1986 during ascent going into space, and then Columbia in 2003 when it returned from space. So this flying in space is still a risky business, whether it be a suborbital event or an orbital event when there's much larger energies involved. Even during the testing of Virgin Galactic Spaceship 2 in 2014, there was a tragic accident that occurred in flight in which the wings of the vehicle deployed prematurely caused the craft to spin out of control. One of the two test pilots was fortunate enough to be able to eject from the spacecraft, but the other one unfortunately did not and was killed upon impact. So spaceflight is always involved in determining risks and what is an acceptable level of risk for those that are involved going into space. But commercial spaceflight is different from state-sponsored space program. What happens when something goes wrong? Commercial space travel will require a system of responsibility and liability for cases in which the space tourist suffers injury, loss, or damage. One of the things I want to point out is as these commercial flights gear up and they start to build a brand with Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic, fly with us for this reason or fly with us for this reason, it harkens back to basically the Concorde, which was a supersonic transport that flew both by British Airways and Air France. And in 2000, some might recall, Air France had a flight called flight number 4590, and this was a chartered flight from France that took off going to the United States. Of course, the Concorde is a supersonic aircraft, going faster than the speed of sound. It flew for over 25 years. The program was highly successful and very well rated as high safety. But unfortunately, at this time, there was an accident. While the craft was taking off from France, there was some debris on the runway, and the landing gear hit that debris. That debris kicked up underneath the aircraft. It punctured one of the fuel tanks because the aircraft was fully fueled at that time. And it also punctured some of the hydraulic lines that controlled the landing gear. So during this very critical moment of takeoff and landing, which are really super critical for any type of aircraft, a fire broke out underneath and caused the fuel to essentially ignite. They could not deploy the landing gear, and so the craft basically perished and crashed all on board. There's 100 and some people killed on board. Effectively, it terminated the Concorde's flight program. Here was the case where it was very commercial, it was profitable to some degree, and it had a very good safety record, but one single incident, very high profile one at that, where you can see some of these images taken from the ground, basically terminated that program. So this is something that could indeed happen with our commercial flights in space. And are we prepared to terminate the entire program for one particular incident? What level of risk are we as a society willing to take and accept, even though these customers in many regards are very high profile individuals who are willing to pay a lot of money and perhaps even celebrities? One of the last items that I was going to touch on, and I won't touch on it too much here because it was targeted for our congressman who's not present here, is what about taxes? These commercial flights, believe it or not, have a certain amount of tax revenue that some people in Congress are looking at. Moments after the Blue Origin's New Shepard safely landed in Texas, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee announced he would introduce legislation to tax both suborbital and orbital flights, basically arguing that these flights here are being paid for by very people with lots of means. So we tax regular flights, aircraft flights, motel taxes. There's taxes all over the place, so why not these? So he has introduced legislation into Congress to see about taxing some of these commercial flights as well. So whether that will succeed or not, it's kind of up in the air, so to speak. But most likely as more of these occur, chances are that revenue stream might be too strong of an attraction to kind of avoid within Congress. So, there was my little graphic for the taxes part. So far we've seen the rise of commercial space flight for humans in suborbital form, basically going up and coming back. Both of the Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic flights were impressive, but they're still not that far removed from the same experience one would get on a very long and high roller coaster. They for sure differ in terms of risk and prestige. Also, there's the feeling of being on the cutting edge of technology along with being among the first to do something. One gets none of that from riding Disney's Space Mountain, for example. So what about getting paying customers into orbit? SpaceX founder Elon Musk has done some amazing things with a series of Falcon launch vehicles that most of us probably are familiar with and watching. They've been pretty routine. A lot of flights have occurred. Commercial flights, basically ferrying cargo and crew to the International Space Station as well as satellites into space. His company is planning on launching the first all-private citizen flight into space as part of SpaceX's Inspiration 4 mission that, if everything is on target, is going to begin just next month. If all goes well, the 3-day flight will launch sometime probably around September 4th or 6th, and will be the first human space flight to orbit the Earth with exclusively private citizens on board. The flight will be privately operated by SpaceX using a previously flown Crew Dragon capsule launched into Earth orbit. But there's going to be some modifications to that Dragon capsule. The biggest one is that nice dome that's on the top there, which basically, this is normally the docking portion here, where the spacecraft, when it docks with the International Space Station's lid pivots or hinges up, and then this part here is where the astronauts crawl to and from the ISS. But in place of that, they put this really cool observation dome so that the crew members on board will be able to take in the view, because they're not going to be up there just for 10 or 15 minutes like the suborbital hops, but they're going to be up there for days, and they can really, really enjoy the view. This whole effort is going to be chronicled by Netflix starting next month with a docu-series called Countdown, which essentially will cover this flight, their training up to it, the actual flight, the duration of the flight, and the landing. And here are the 4 crew members that are going to participate in that if indeed all goes well. So what about the rest of us? You know, we're talking about suborbital, orbital flights, people with means to be able to pay for some of these flights. So what about the rest of us? Now, I have to get Star Trek in. People who know me know that I'm a big fan of Star Trek, both the original series as well as some of the follow-on episodes and programs that have launched since then. But on Thursday, January 26, 1967, many folks settled down after dinner to watch television. This was during the time of the networks, and most people only had access to 3 channels. One channel showed an episode of a new television series called Star Trek, which featured the adventures of Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and the crew of the Starship Enterprise as they traveled throughout the galaxy. Halfway into the first season, they aired an episode that involved Captain John Christopher, a young military jet pilot who was scrambled into chasing after a UFO. It turns out that the UFO was the Enterprise, which was hurled back into time from the 23rd century to 1967 after breaking away from a black hole. This young pilot was transported aboard the massive starship just before his frail jet fighter broke up due to the effects of a tractor beam that the Enterprise used out of fear of attack. While adjusting to life aboard the Enterprise, Captain Kirk learns that Captain Christopher's son would later command the first mission to the planet Saturn. In order to maintain his history timeline, the crew needed to return him back to Earth and at the same time destroy any evidence that the Enterprise ever visited the Earth in 1967. All of this, of course, is done in the 1-hour time frame of the episode, while also returning the Enterprise back to its own time so that it can continue to have episodes in the weekly series. So I bring up this very fictional television series because it has some very factional connections relative to my discussion this evening. Because less than 24 hours after that episode aired on January 26, 1967, the world would learn of a tragedy that put into jeopardy not only our bold plans to go into space, but our audacious attempts to land humans on the surface of another world. Whereas the fictional Star Trek universe, Captain John Christopher survived so that his son would grow up and journey to Saturn, the real world crew of NASA's Apollo 1 mission were all tragically killed. And of course, we know the story about Apollo 1. Shortly after that tragic accident, members of the National Space Club, which is comprised of industry and government representatives, along with the educational institutions and the press who sought to promote leadership in the brand new field of astronautics, gathered for the annual Goddard Memorial Dinner that was held in Washington, D.C. This annual event, sponsored by the club, is named after American space pioneer Robert H. Goddard and recognizes persons and institutions that have made outstanding contributions to space science and technology during the previous year. Organizers of the dinner invited Leonard Nimoy to attend. Nimoy, of course, who played Mr. Spock in Star Trek, proved to be a breakout character for the show. On March 15th, 1967, all the space people from NASA and its contractors were at the Black Tie Affair. This included John Glen, the first American to orbit space, go into space, his wife, Annie. This is the administrator of NASA, James Webb. Okay. This is Robert Goddard's widow. Robert Goddard, of course, father of American rocketry in space, passed away, but his wife lived on at this time in 1967. And over here is Vice President Hubert Humphrey. And of course, you can probably recognize this character here with his little pointed, not ears, but sideburns. That's Leonard Nimoy, who played Mr. Spock. And he's meeting with Barbara Moran of the NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center to kind of review what comments he would make at this dinner. So all these people were here, barely 6 weeks after the Apollo 1 fire. You know, the mood among everyone present at this event was tempered by the realization that the moon landing might be delayed. Some folks even speculated that the Apollo program might be canceled altogether. At the reception, the Nimoys were introduced to those who would share the front table with them. As I mentioned, it was John Glen, Webb, Hubert Humphrey, and of course Robert Goddard. The memory of the Apollo 1 accident was still very much in the minds of everyone that evening. As the Vice President launched into his speech, he acknowledged to the over 1,000 people then attending, quote, "We cannot help but keep in mind that this is an occasion for remembrance with sorrow, and also with great pride of 3 gallant men and 3 of my friends and your friends who perished." At the end of the Vice President's speech, people gathered not around the Vice President, but around Leonard Nimoy. They were almost cordial, wrote Leonard Nimoy of that evening. All of them wanted autographs and pictures for themselves and their children. Webb, Glen, and even Hubert Humphrey were very, very excited to get Mr. Spock's autograph. Recall, at this time, people had been flying into space for fewer than 7 years. Star Trek was showing people exploring the galaxy hundreds of years into the future. That evening, people looked beyond what had recently happened with the Apollo 1 fire. While shaking hands and signing autographs, those attending the dinner saw not just an actor in their midst, but Mr. Spock, a representative from the future who knew that what they were doing in their century may have been very painful, but was necessary in order for them to boldly move forward into the next. For the 500,000 workers employed to support the Apollo program during one of the darkest hours in NASA's history, Star Trek gave them hope. Nimoy wrote of that evening, quote, "I do not overstate the fact when I tell you that the interest in the show is so intense that it would almost seem they feel we are a dramatization of the future of their space program, and they have been completely taken us to heart. They are in fact proud of the show as though in some way it represents them." Star Trek broke new ground in science fiction and showed a future where access in space was routine. But more importantly, it showed a future where space travel was not just for a privileged few, but for everyone. The series presented a vision of space travel that was not only real but commonplace, where everyone, young and old, men and women, black and white, blue and green, human and aliens, would travel together through the galaxy. Star Trek showed that we could boldly go where no one had gone before, but in order to do so, we had to overcome adversity to get there in order to keep on going. So in closing, Will the spaceflight of Star Trek's imaginary 23rd century become commonplace? I think that in the here and now, the suborbital flights of Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin can offer a commercial market for those with an enormous amount of disposable income. For reasons I previously discussed, whether that market is sustainable beyond the novelty stage is yet to be proven, since you can see how it can be highly vulnerable to outside forces. If we are going to leave the planet on a routine basis, we have already seen dramatic reductions in the cost of doing so, thanks to SpaceX. As I speak, Musk is assembling a starship, not unlike that of the USS Enterprise from Star Trek. This vehicle, even though it doesn't go faster than the speed of light, is already entering in history books as the largest and most powerful rocket ever to be assembled. Will it fly? That remains to be seen. It's going to go someplace soon. Whether that is upward, outward, or both, it will make for an interesting viewing from a safe distance. Will the public remain excited about seeing wealthy people going into space, or will they interpret it as another sign of how they and potentially the broader space industry as a whole are disconnected from reality amid more down-to-earth concerns? Anthropologist Dina Weibel-Swanson, a well-known researcher in the field of space tourism and a close personal friend, sums it up best in a recently published paper of hers called Following the Path That Heroes Carved into History, Space Tourism, Heritage, and Faith in the Future. Quote, "These privately funded space travelers describe themselves as not just fulfilling the dream of going into space, but also helping bring about and normalize private space travel. Their desire to experience what their childhood heroes experienced motivated them to network, invest money, and push the private space industry forward so that spaceflight would open up to them and eventually perhaps to private citizens of tomorrow. Their awareness of the history of spaceflight inspired them to want to help create the future of spaceflight." The millionaires that brought us these commercial flights into space all grew up with Star Trek. These visionaries were all inspired by science fiction when they were younger. In the black and white pages of Pulp Fiction and on the fuzzy screens of early network television, they read and watched how routine access to space was critical in exploring the universe. What better way to grow up and spend their wealth than to try and make the routine access to space possible for all? To the two winners of the Chaffee Scholarship that are present this evening, and those that have won it in the past, I want to tell you that don't be deterred by the setbacks that have or undoubtedly will occur as these visionaries help us achieve the goal of routine and inexpensive access to space. The scholarship that you won is a reminder that this business is a risky one. Do not be deterred, but continue to be inspired by what you see happening today, while at the same time, remember and learn from what has happened in the past so that you will continue to be an inspiration to others as you chart your career path to boldly go where no man has gone before. Excuse me, where no one has gone before. Thank you. So I'll open this up to questions. I'm sorry about the no man